farmers, tired of mounting Dad, picked up and left. The once proud Main Street of Harmony was a shell, with family-owned businesses gutted and replaced by shady pawn shops and bars with tinted windows. There was nowhere else for us to go. Father was too proud to walk away from the land. My great-great-grandfather built this farm. We ain't leaving. He was a real mean bastard, my old man. Always had been since the day I was born. Mother was a quiet, submissive woman, and while I loved her, there was little she could do to shield me from his drunken rage. You know, when the Lord took her from us a few years back, it was unexpected, brutal, and left me alone to manage the farm with a man whose demeanor only grew darker with every swallow of his cheap rat-gut whiskey. Our farm hands became less farm hands and more drinking buddies. It wasn't unusual for me to be jolted awake in the middle of the night. The blast of my old man's sawed-off, double-barreled shotgun and exploding blasts as the three of them hooted and hollered, having target practice from the sagging porch of our once grand farmhouse. It was an early morning after one of those late-night target practice sessions, and an unseasonable early cold chill swept through the rustling stalks of corn, and I wanted to get up early to do some maintenance on our ancient John Deere grain combine. Everything on our farm was falling apart, and it was up to me to fix it or face my father's wrath. That morning, he was passed out on the porch, shotgun still in his lap, flanked by Silas and Tom.
You're good.
He was face down on the floor as I quietly tiptoed down the porch there as my boots crunched over a large piece of glass from the previous night's events. It was enough to stir them. Wide-eyed, I whirled around and met eyes with my old man. With a sadistic grin, he raised his shotgun. "You want to wake me up this goddamn early in the morning, you clumsy bastard? Better run, boy." I took off running as he wildly started firing shots in my general direction. I could hear Silas and Tom laughing just as loud as thunder. Tears streamed down my face as I ran into the cornfield. I could run away, but where would I go? I had no money, no friends. I didn't even go to school. I barely knew how to read. This godforsaken farm was the only place I knew. I was trapped here. I was working on the rusty header from the combine when I first noticed the old Scarecrow. He'd been there for as long as I could remember, to the point where I barely noticed him when I went by. He was perched high above the ground, nailed to a withered T-shaped post in a way that reminded me of the billboards that dotted the road outside of town. A bloody Jesus, nailed to the cross, eyes open wide, face contoured in pain, promising eternal damnation for those who've not been saved. I put down my tools and stood up, regarding the Scarecrow more closely. He was made up of old coveralls and tattered burlap sacks stuffed with hay that protruded from every extremity. His face was an old rubber Halloween jack-o'-lantern mask, faded and worn from years of being exposed to the elements. Staring into the black eye holes, a throaty whisper spoke to me. "It's time, Jesse." I whirled around, expecting to find Silas or Tom, but was only met with the waving stalks of corn. I turned back to the Scarecrow. I couldn't help but notice.
At least he made it to the traffic light in time.
Crossbeam. Hay loosely fell around him. It had to be the wind. He didn't just move. I was tired. I had work to do. I was too old to be getting creeped out by a stupid Scarecrow. Turning my attention back to the grain combine, I had barely picked up my tools when I heard shuffling behind me. like hay being thrashed about with a pitchfork. The hair stood up on the back of my neck as a cold chill shot through me. With rising adrenaline and terror, I slowly turned around to see the Scarecrow standing before me. He raised his filthy gloved finger and pointed it right at me. The black void behind his eye holes of his mask burned through me, rooted to the ground. Eyes wide with disbelief and terror, the wrench dropped from my hand. The brittle voice spoke to me. There's no need to be afraid, Jesse. I've been part of this land long before your people. Let me help you. Let me help your poor soul. Haven't you suffered enough? Frozen in terror, his voice held me in place. Let me help you, poor soul. The word reverberated in my head. Nobody had ever helped me. I recalled Mother telling me when I was young that God works in mysterious ways. Maybe this was my way out.
Maybe one day we can turn to the Waldwick School and like just record that a little.
Jesse.
Don't know why, but
He seemed more human now.
there's places I've been
Fluid
to.
in his movement, as if shifting forms. The tattered glove had reached out for me. It felt warm, real. Somewhere in the distance, the urgent cawing of a crow began to fill the air. My breath became shallow as I reached out to him. I felt shaky on my feet. The sounds of the crows grew louder and louder as my vision began to dim. The darkness enveloped me as I watched him transform. The weathered jack-o'-lantern mask was less a mask and more flesh and blood. With the void behind the eye holes now glowing an intense red, I jolted awake from the start. Disoriented and blurry-eyed, I began to focus and realized I was sitting in the passenger seat in the cab of the grain combine. Within seconds, the memory returned. Let me help you, Jesse. I whirled my head to the side to find the Scarecrow sitting in the driver's seat. He had now fully transformed. He wasn't human, but something else. The jack-o'-lantern mask was now terrifying, flesh and blood resemblance of a human face. He smiled a wide, jagged smile and pointed off into the darkness, beyond the windshield of the combine. I noticed the motor was running. The smell of diesel filled my nose. I followed the gaze of the Scarecrow and noticed movement on the ground ahead. And there was my old man, Silas and Tom, thrashing around like madmen and trying to scream for help through the rags that had been stuffed in their mouths. The three of them had been securely hog-tied, and they all looked like they had been on the receiving end of a barroom beating. Who did this to them, I thought? It couldn't have been. It's time, Jesse. You know what must be done. The horrifying realization dawning on me, I now knew how the Scarecrow intended to help me. The Scarecrow creature revved the engine and threw the gear into drive. The combine began to lurch forward as a rotor blades began to spin. Please, no.
Well,
I began to scream.
we didn't hear the
before
whole
I even
story,
had a
that's
chance
why.
to protest. The Scarecrow reached across and wound his skeleton fingers around my neck and with a surprising intensity. This is what you wanted, Jesse. I am going to free you from this place. The Scarecrow laughed as my eyes went wide. The combine bounced with a sickening crush as the whirling rotator blades ran over the three hog-tied men in the field. Their sickening screams cut short as they were sucked inside the powerful machine. For a brief moment, I recalled being in the kitchen with my mother, standing over the blender, helping her puree tomatoes from the garden. I watched in wonder as the fat, ripe tomatoes were instantly liquefied.